once we've got an awareness of ourselves, the audience, the world in which that audience lives, once we've got a sense of our culture, the bedrock from which we work and from our traditions and our customs spring, the next step then I call translation. Now, translation isn't about trying to translate the biblical Greek and Hebrew into English or into another language. That's not the translation I'm referring to here. What I'm talking about is the translation of concepts, the translation of themes and ideas that come out of the exegesis to translate them into our context. And the problem is that it's very difficult to do because our contexts are so different. And they're different not only by virtue of geography, that in fact what happens in the Bible happens a long way away from where we live, but rather, or even for that matter, time, but rather that things have changed so much over the last 2,000 years. And that's only for the New Testament. When you go back 3,500 years to the time of Abram and those people and Moses, what we realize is that things have changed dramatically. And so therefore, to actually take those concepts and translate them into our context is really part of the process of developing a sermon. And that's therefore the process of hermeneutics, the concept of translation. And now, translation has got many different parts that it needs to be translated. There's many different aspects or parts of translation that need to take place. One, for example, is technology. Today, we take our technology for granted. We take the things as simple as a light bulb. One of those things about light bulbs is that it's a recent invention. And yet the time of Jesus, of course, there were no light bulbs. You had a candle, you maybe had oil and a wick in order to be able to give light. At night, once the sun went down, there was nothing. You couldn't travel at night. There were no street lights. It was dangerous, extremely dangerous. You could easily fall off the edge of something. And when we come to terms with that, we begin to have an insight into when Jesus talks about himself as the light of the world. Notice what it means when he says, I'm the light of the world, in a world which, when the sun goes down, is absolutely dark. Of course, for us to call himself the light of the world, when in fact, here in a place like Sydney, we never see darkness. It never is truly dark. When we look outside, we can always see the street lamps. In fact, when we look up to the skies, we can only see the brightest stars. In the time of Jesus, the reason why the psalmist can actually write such wonderful poetry about the heavens and about talking about the stars and the moon and the sun is because they can see them. And because they're the only lights in the sky. They're the only light available at night. So technologically, we need to realize that technology makes a huge impact in the images that Jesus is trying to say. That when he talks about the fact that we need to be a lamp put up on a hill, again, we need to realize that in the place which is absolute darkness, a light set on the hill can be seen from everywhere because it's the only light that's available. Technology needs to be translated. We can't just take for granted that the technology will be there. The other concepts, for example, is environment. The environment that we live in is very different. Unless, of course, you're living in the outback of New South Wales or outback of Australia, the one you're going to find is that, in fact, for most of us, we acknowledge water and running water. We see rivers. That's not the kind of thing that would have been there during the time of Jesus. The reason why Jesus can talk about water all the time, the reason why the image of God's love and God's care that proceeds from him is given as a river, is because those are images that would have been profound for the people who heard it. The reason why the concept of the desert is again used as a way of connecting to the environment in which it's there. But that all has to be translated in order to come into our context. What we have to do is to see that there is a difference in the way in which that comes. And so to do hermeneutics, we have to translate it into our culture. We have to translate it into our environment. And we need to be very careful about that translation. When the missionaries came to South Africa, They came and wanted to write the Bible in the Zulu language. And so they came and they asked, who is the great God? Who is the greatest God among the Zulu? And of course they were told that his name was Zulu. And the thing with it is that they then decided that they would name, wherever it said God in the Bible, they would call him Zulu. The only problem was that none of the Zulus wanted to convert, because Zulu was an evil god. So why would one want to be a follower of an evil god? In fact, the good God wasn't the best or wasn't the top God, was a secondary God. And so the missionaries had to realize that their translation was a problem, because it didn't connect with the culture that they were beginning to preach and talk to. And so they had to redo their translation. And I want you to understand that that's part of what we do in preaching, is we translate, is we take the Word of God and we go through the process of hermeneutics, of translation, and translate it to the people for our culture, for our time, for our process. There are many others. There are many other processes that we need to go through in translation. Things like occupation. Today, when we look at fishermen, we say that fishermen are kind of lower on the totem pole because they haven't got the education that maybe lawyers and doctors have. But that wasn't the case in the time of Jesus. In the time of Jesus, fishermen were actually highly prized because they made money. They were entrepreneurs. They were the people who could bring food into the process. And of course, in an agricultural society, the ones who could actually produce food are actually highly prized rather than lowly valued. And so there's occupation, there's the issues of religion, there's the issues of education and of history. Each of these things have to be translated in order to be understood by our culture. When Jesus calls himself a shepherd, how do we understand that if we don't have sheep? How do we understand the role of the shepherd? And more importantly, how do we preach that process to people who've never seen sheep and who certainly don't know anything about being shepherds? What's the use of Jesus being called a shepherd? In some ways, what we have to do then is we have to translate that image of a shepherd to that context, to find maybe some parallels or the connections, the themes that come out of it in the original, and translate that for the current.